Lou, the problem occurred just as they were preparing to throttle down the engines. Rick Chappell, a NASA scientist, is with us. Rick, they lost one of the 3 engines on the shuttle.
Right.
How serious is that?
The center engine, they said, was shut down. The other 2 engines were running fine at 104%. They should just run the other engines longer to make up for the center engine, but I can't tell yet. It's happening right now.
They say that they're going into an actual orbit which will be lower than the one that they had planned for, which could possibly mean that some, if not all, of the scientific experiments that were planned for Challenger and Space Lab 3 may not take place. They could possibly return after a couple of orbits around the Earth back to landing, one of the emergency landing sites in Spain or somewhere else.
No, I think we're past the emergency landing site thing now. The code for this is abort to orbit, which says you've got enough capability to get to orbit, so you go to orbit, and that's what they're doing. They're now adjusting the OMS burns. The OMS are the orbital maneuvering system, the engines that are up here on the orbiter that actually can adjust its orbit once it's there. So we'll have to see.
Let's turn the model around here so we can show you exactly what is taking place now as Challenger is moving into space.
Okay, the center engine went down during ascent. That's this engine. The other 2 engines, main engines, are running fine at 104%. It will go into orbit. Once in orbit, it uses the engines that are up here, these 2 orbital maneuvering system engines that can then continue to adjust the orbit once they're in orbit.
Is it possible for them to reach a full orbit with only 2 of the 3 engines?
I believe so, and that's what they're looking at now. They're doing calculations right now that will say how they should fire the OMS engines, how much thrust the OMS engines need to put in order to achieve orbit, the closest orbit. Yeah, and they're saying now, they're still looking at things now, trying to determine exactly what the orbit capability is. It will be in orbit. It's a question of what orbit and how does that match what they need.
Okay, so a problem has developed on the flight of Challenger Space Lab 2. A few moments after liftoff, the center engine on the Challenger shut down, and they are now running on 2 engines and modifying very quickly what they plan to do after they've lost one of the main engines on the Space Shuttle Challenger. We, of course, will keep you up to date here on CNN throughout the mission, and if any situation develops, we will get back to you as soon as we can. Lou?
Dr. Chappell, any idea what might have caused that engine to fail?
No ideas yet. The data that come down as the engine runs should give the engineers an idea of what's happened, but as right now, they don't know.
Okay. And as I mentioned, it's developing right now. We'll keep you posted on the flight of the Challenger. Now to Mary.
Initial orbit was 141 by 106 instead of 181. But now they're firing the OMS engines, which are the smaller engines that are part of the orbiter, to continue to adjust the orbiter. The question then is what orbit you can ultimately reach using the OMS engines. They have just done a successful burn at 33 minutes. It lasted a couple of minutes. They're about halfway around the Earth at this stage. They'll do a second burn, more than likely, and they will continue to adjust the orbit with the onboard engines. So we don't know yet. We're in the process of setting up the orbit.
NASA is saying that there is, right now, the crew is in no danger, and at first they thought they might have to go once around and return either to White Sands, New Mexico, or back at the Kennedy Space Center. And in Houston, at the Johnson Space Center, we have CNN's Tony Clark on the live line now. Tony, what can you tell us about the decisions they're trying to make in Houston right now?
We'll know a little bit more at 6 o'clock Eastern Time. That's when the post-launch briefing is going to take place. But right now, NASA is downplaying the problem. They say the abort to orbit, the phrase that we heard early on that let us know that there's a problem, doesn't really tell the problem. The phrase abort seems to mean to say that it's all over, and it is not. They said that they're going to be 44, 45 miles lower in an orbit. That may change some of the science plans, some of the science experiments. But right now, the plans are to continue with a 7-day orbit, 7-day mission, rather, and continue on and do everything that they can. Right now, they're assessing the problems that may be caused from this lower orbit, but right now, everything is going, as you said, the crew as well, and they are trying to get into a circular orbit so that they can continue on with their mission.
Okay, Tony, we'll be checking back with you a little later once NASA has its regular post-launch briefing that they have with each launch. Unfortunately, they'll be having a lot more to talk about on this one. Once again, the Space Shuttle Challenger, just after liftoff, one of its 3 main engines shut down about 3 minutes prematurely. We're able to push into the stable orbit, as they call it, and it's close to a nominal orbit or a proper orbit, and they're trying to inch the shuttle up to where it should be, 186 miles out in space. They say at present there are no plans to return Challenger to Earth. They plan to continue on with the 7-day mission with a scheduled landing August 5th at Edwards Air Force Base in California. So, Rick, it looks like that at least some of the scientific data will go on if they're going to stay for 7 days.
I think very definitely, and as I said, we need to stay with them. They're not quite through the first orbit yet to see what sort of adjustments they're able to make. Then the scientists will look at the orbit, play that against what the nominal orbit should have been, look at the times, the lightings, and then make some corrections or adjustments in their operations timeline for doing the experiments as we go. So we'll just have to see how things develop.
So as Challenger makes its move up to its proper orbit, we of course will stay here and keep you informed on CNN and bring you all of the latest developments as they occur. Lou?
Tom, Dr. Chappell, if I might, they're in orbit now and they're concerned about the orbit, but the ship is safe. But there was, when the engine failed 3 minutes prematurely, some talk of an emergency landing in Spain. There might be a landing either White Sands or Cape Canaveral. What were the immediate concerns surrounding talk like that?
Well, once you lose one of the engines, you look at the performance of the other two. The other two are running fine at what they call 104%, so they were running fine. They calculated then that they had plenty of boost or propulsion to get the spaceship into orbit. So the abort to orbit is what the call that was made. They could have at that point, had there not been enough power in the other 2 engines, gone into Spain, transatlantic abort. But there was plenty of boost in the engines to get them on into orbit.
Would there have been any concern if one engine went down that maybe a second might go down?
As long as, of course, the computers are continuously monitoring the performance of the other 2 engines. As long as that's okay, then you go on if you calculate you have enough power, and they did.
Okay. We'll continue following the story. Tom and Tier, Rick Chappell, now to Mary Alice in New York.
From Washington.
An hour ago, NASA has scheduled a press briefing. In just a few minutes, we'll try to bring some of that to you, and our coverage will continue. But first, here's Flip Spicer with a look at the weather.
3, 2, 1. Ignition and liftoff. We have liftoff of Challenger in Space Lab 2. The shuttle has...
The liftoff looked good, but before orbit, a failure of one of the shuttle Challenger's main engines. The problems persist. We continue to cover the story. Good evening, I'm Lou Waters. Newswatch continues.
And I'm Mary Alice Williams in New York. NASA officials are now trying to figure out how serious the problem is and what they can do about it. It's the first time in 19 shuttle flights that an engine has failed after blastoff. For a live update, let's go to CNN's Tom Mintier and NASA's Rick Chappell in Atlanta.
Mary Alice, they're trying to make some very important decisions right now. The Space Shuttle Challenger is not in any danger, Rick. They're moving very slowly and trying to establish the normal orbit that they would have achieved with 3 engines simply by burning the 2 engines they have remaining a little longer than they normally would have to get the shuttle up to the 186 miles out in space that it needs to be. So they've simply lost 1 engine. They're going to have to reassess what they do 7 days from now when they have to bring the shuttle back. Is there any problem, Rick, with returning with only 2 engines?
Well, let's see. Let's recap where we are. One of the engines, one of the 3 main engines, went out on launch or after several minutes of flight. The other 2 carried them into orbit. So there was an abort to orbit, is what it was called. It's a stable orbit. The orbit was not as high as they wanted. Now they're in a period, and they're about 2/3 of the way around the Earth now from the launch. Now they're in a period of adjusting the orbit using the OMS engines, the Orbital Maneuvering System engines that are in the orbiter. And they will get the orbit as close as they can to what the originally planned orbit was. Once it's been determined how far or how close to the original orbit they can get, then they will look at replanning. And that involves changing timing of when you do different experiments. Because if the orbit is at a different altitude, then the sun, as the orbiter goes around the Earth, the sun comes up and sets at different times, and so the solar experiments would have to run at different times. And each experiment, or each of the pointed experiments that look at the sun or the stars or other things, their timing will have to be changed, adjusted in the timeline. But first, they need to see how close they can get to the originally planned orbit. And that's what they're doing right now.
Is this something that will be done by computer, where they'll simply plug in new times, and
That's
the
right.
computer will handle all of the calculations of when they have to do
Well, in terms of approaching orbit and getting as good an orbit as they can, the computer does the calculations on that, gives them indications of for how long and when to burn the engines in the orbiter that are currently in the orbiter. As far as the science itself, then the scientists come in and begin to interact once they have an orbit, begin to interact and work out the best times.
All right, so NASA is making some decisions now, and we expect to hear from them shortly on what they plan to do, and when we do, we will bring it to you here, of course, live on CNN. Lou?
All right, John.